Rose Whitfield had learned to make herself invisible long before she understood why invisibility was necessary for survival. Her 23 years having been shaped by the harsh lesson that a woman without family, fortune, or influential name was considered little more than a burden to be discarded by polite society. Cast out from the only home she had ever known at the tender age of 16, when her guardian's new wife decided that her husband's ward was an unnecessary expense and potential embarrassment, Rose had spent 7 years navigating the treacherous waters of London's working class, taking whatever employment she could find while carefully guarding the secret of her gentle birth and the education that marked her as different from her fellow servants. She had worked as a seamstress in a cramped attic room where the light was poor and the pay poorer, as a companion to elderly ladies who treated her with the casual cruelty reserved for those dependent on their charity, and most recently, as a governess to the unruly children of a merchant family who valued her services but never let her forget her precarious position in their household. Through it all, Rose had maintained the quiet dignity that was her birthright and the only inheritance her late parents had left her, refusing to let circumstances break her spirit, even as they tested her resolve daily. She had learned to dress modestly to avoid unwanted attention, to speak softly to avoid giving offense, and to keep her thoughts and dreams locked safely away where they could not be used against her by those who held power over her survival. But on this particular foggy November evening in 1817, as Rose hurried through the narrow streets of Mayfair carrying a basket of mending that would earn her enough coins to pay for another week's lodging in her tiny rented room, fate was about to intervene in the form of Duke Christopher Vale, a man whose reputation for honor and unwavering principles had made him both respected and feared through the highest circles of English society. The Duke, 36 years old, and possessed of the kind of moral authority that came from never compromising his values for convenience or profit, was returning from a particularly frustrating session in the House of Lords, where he had once again found himself standing alone against popular opinion in defense of what he believed to be right, when his attention was caught by the sight of a young woman being accosted by 3 drunken gentlemen who clearly considered her fair game for their amusement. What Christopher saw in that moment was not a helpless victim requiring rescue, but a woman of obvious breeding and education who was facing her attackers with a courage that spoke to an inner strength that circumstances had tested but not broken. Her chin raised in defiance, even as her hands trembled with fear, her voice steady as she attempted to reason with men who had no intention of listening. To reason. "Gentlemen, please, Rose was saying, her cultured tones marking her as someone who had fallen from a higher station. "I have done nothing to offend you, and I ask only to be allowed to continue on my way." But the men, emboldened by drink and the assumption that a woman alone on the streets after dark was available for their entertainment, only laughed at her request, their leader reaching out to grab her arm with a familiarity that made Christopher's blood boil with righteous anger. "Come now, sweetheart," the man slurred, his grip tightening as Rose tried to pull away. "Don't be so unfriendly. We're only looking for a bit of company, and you look like you could use some protection." It was the mockery in that last word, the implication that Rose's vulnerability was something to be exploited rather than respected, that finally spurred Christopher into action, his sense of justice overriding the social conventions that might have dictated a more cautious approach to intervening in what others might consider a common street altercation. "I believe the lady has made her wishes clear," Christopher said, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed as he stepped out of the shadows, his tall frame and aristocratic bearing immediately commanding attention even in the dim light of the street lamps. "I suggest you respect them and continue on your way." The transformation in the men's behavior was immediate and telling. The moment they recognized the Duke of Vale, their bravado evaporated like morning mist, replaced by the kind of nervous deference that powerful men inspired in those who depended on their goodwill for social and economic survival. But it was Rose's reaction that truly captured Christopher's attention, for instead of the grateful relief he might have expected, he saw in her eyes a complex mixture of gratitude and wariness, as though she understood that rescue often came with a price that might prove higher than the original danger. "Your Grace," she said, offering a curtsy that was perfectly executed despite her obvious distress. "I thank you for your intervention, though I assure you it was unnecessary. I am quite capable of managing my own affairs." The quiet dignity in her voice, The refusal to play the role of helpless victim, even in circumstances that would have justified such behavior, struck Christopher as profoundly moving and utterly unexpected, marking the beginning of an encounter that would challenge everything he thought he knew about social class, moral obligation, and the true meaning of nobility. The fog that had settled over London like a grey shroud seemed to muffle not just sound, but hope itself, creating a world where the boundaries between respectability and desperation became dangerously blurred. Rose Whitfield pulled her worn cloak more tightly around her shoulders as she navigated the familiar streets of Mayfair, her steps quick but careful on the slippery cobblestones, her mind focused on the task that would determine whether she ate a proper meal that week or made do with bread and weak tea. At 23, Rose possessed a beauty that she had learned to disguise rather than display. Her auburn hair always pulled back in the severest style possible, her green eyes kept downcast to avoid drawing attention, her naturally graceful figure hidden beneath layers of practical grey wool that marked her station as clearly as any uniform. She had been told often enough that her appearance was her greatest asset, but 7 years of hard experience had taught her that beauty without protection was more curse than blessing for a woman in her position. The basket of mending she carried represented 3 days of careful work by candlelight. Her fingers pricked raw from the fine needlework that wealthy ladies required but were unwilling to pay fairly for. Each perfectly executed stitch was a small act of defiance against the circumstances that had reduced her from the daughter of a gentleman to a woman who survived by the skill of her hands and the strength of her will. "Rose! Rose Whitfield!" a voice called from behind her, and she turned to see Mrs. Hartwell, the cook from the merchant household where she had recently been employed as governess, hurrying toward her with obvious agitation. "Mrs. Hartwell," Rose replied, pausing despite her eagerness to complete her errand. "Is something wrong? Are the children well?" "The children are fine, dear, but I had to warn you," the older woman said, glancing around nervously as though afraid of being overheard. "And the master's been asking questions about you, about your family, your background. His wife's been filling his head with suspicions, saying it's not natural for a governess to speak and carry herself like a lady born." Rose felt her stomach clench with familiar dread. She had been careful, so careful, to present herself as nothing more than a well-educated woman of modest background seeking honest employment. But her accent, her mannerisms, the unconscious habits of deportment that had been drilled into her from childhood, these things had a way of revealing themselves despite her best efforts. "What kind of questions?" Rose asked quietly, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "About your parents, your education, why a woman of your obvious breeding would be working as a governess. Mrs. Pemberton's convinced there's something scandalous in your past, something that would reflect poorly on the family if it became known." Rose closed her eyes briefly, feeling the familiar weight of her precarious position settling over her like a physical burden. "I see. And what did you tell them?" "Nothing, of course," Mrs. Hartwell said firmly. "It's not my place to speculate about your circumstances. And besides, you've been nothing but kind to those children and respectful to the family. But Rose, dear, I think you should start looking for other employment. Mrs. Pemberton's the type to make trouble when she gets an idea in her head." After Mrs. Hartwell departed with a sympathetic pat on Rose's shoulder, Rose continued her journey with a heavy heart. Another position lost. Another family who would eventually decide that her presence was more liability than asset. She had become expert at reading the signs, the subtle changes in how she was addressed, the way conversations stopped when she entered a room, the gradual erosion of trust that inevitably preceded her dismissal. It was this preoccupation with her uncertain future that made her less aware of her surroundings than usual, less alert to the dangers that lurked in the shadows of even the most fashionable neighborhoods after dark. She didn't notice the 3 gentlemen who had been following her for several blocks, their expensive clothing and obvious intoxication making them bold in ways that daylight and sobriety might have prevented. "Well, well," the tallest of the 3 said as they finally cornered her in a narrow alley between 2 grand townhouses, his voice slurred with drink and entitlement. "What have we here?" A little dove, all alone and unprotected. Rose felt her heart begin to race. But years of navigating difficult situations had taught her to maintain her composure even when fear threatened to overwhelm her. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands, "I believe there has been some misunderstanding. I am simply trying to complete an errand and return to my lodgings. Oh, but that's no fun at all, the second man said, moving closer with the predatory confidence of someone who had never been denied anything he wanted. A pretty girl like you shouldn't be wandering the streets alone. It's dangerous. You need protection. I assure you, I require no protection, Rose replied, taking a step backward, only to find her path blocked by the third man, who had circled behind her while she was focused on his companions. Come now, sweetheart, the leader said, reaching out to grab her arm with a familiarity that made Rose's skin crawl. Don't be so unfriendly. We're gentlemen of quality, and we're offering you our companionship. Surely that's better than whatever sordid arrangement you're hurrying off to. The implication in his words, the assumption that any woman alone on the streets after dark must be available for their entertainment, filled Rose with a cold fury that temporarily overcame her fear. Oh, sir, you mistake me entirely. I am a respectable woman engaged in honest work, and I demand that you allow me to pass. Respectable? The man laughed, his grip tightening on her arm. Respectable women don't walk the streets alone after dark, my dear. They have fathers and husbands and brothers to protect them. The fact that you're here, unescorted and unprotected, tells us everything we need to know about your respectability. It was at this moment, when Rose's situation seemed most desperate and her options most limited, that a new voice cut through the fog-muffled night like a blade. I believe the lady has made her wishes clear. I suggest you respect them and continue on your way. The voice carried such unmistakable authority that all four people in the alley turned toward its source, though their reactions could not have been more different. The three men immediately released Rose and stepped back, their faces pale with sudden recognition and fear. Rose herself felt a mixture of relief and wariness, understanding that rescue often came with obligations she might not be prepared to meet. Duke Christopher Vale stepped out of the shadows with the kind of presence that commanded attention even in the dim light of the street lamps. At 36, he was a man in the prime of his life, tall and powerfully built, with dark hair that showed the first threads of silver at the temples and grey eyes that seemed to miss nothing. His face was strong and aristocratic, marked by the kind of moral authority that came from never compromising his principles for convenience or profit. Your Grace, the leader of the three men stammered, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. We meant no harm. We were simply offering the young lady our assistance. And your assistance? Christopher repeated, his tone making it clear exactly what he thought of that explanation. How generous of you. I'm certain the lady appreciates your concern for her welfare. Indeed, Your Grace, the second man said, eager to distance himself from what was clearly about to become a very uncomfortable situation. We were just leaving, weren't we, gentlemen? The three men departed with unseemly haste, leaving Rose alone with the Duke in the fog-shrouded alley. She stood perfectly still for a moment, gathering her composure and trying to decide how to handle this unexpected development. Experience had taught her that powerful men rarely acted without expecting something in return, and she was determined not to trade one dangerous situation for another. Your Grace, she said finally, offering a curtsy that was perfectly executed despite her obvious distress. I thank you for your intervention, though I assure you it was unnecessary. I am quite capable of managing my own affairs. Christopher studied her face in the dim light, noting the pride that stiffened her spine despite her vulnerable position, the cultured accent that spoke of an education far superior to what her current circumstances might suggest, and the wariness in her green eyes that told him she had learned not to trust in the kindness of strangers. I'm certain you are, he replied gently, his tone carefully neutral. However, I could not in good conscience allow such assistance to continue unchallenged. May I escort you to your destination? The streets can be dangerous at this hour. Rose hesitated, torn between the practical necessity of accepting his protection and the instinctive caution that had kept her safe for 7 years. That's very kind, Your Grace, but I wouldn't want to impose on your time. I'm certain you have more important matters to attend to. At the moment, Christopher said, offering his arm with the same courtesy he would show to a duchess, I can think of nothing more important than ensuring your safe arrival at your destination. As they walked through the fog-shrouded streets, Christopher found himself increasingly intrigued by his unusual companion. She moved with the unconscious grace of someone born to better circumstances, spoke with the refined accent of the educated upper classes, and carried herself with a dignity that no amount of hardship seemed able to diminish. Yet her clothing, her solitary state, and her obvious familiarity with the working districts of London told a story of dramatic change in fortune. "May I ask your name?" he said, as they paused at a street corner to allow a late-night carriage to pass. "Rose Whitfield, Your Grace," she replied, then added with a slight smile that transformed her entire countenance. And before you ask, yes, I am aware that it's unusual for a woman of my current circumstances to possess such familiarity with proper etiquette. I had an excellent governess in my youth, and I wasn't going to ask," Christopher said, though they both knew he had been curious. "A person's past is their own concern, Miss Whitfield. What matters is their character in the present." "How refreshingly enlightened of you, Your Grace," Rose said, and there was something in her tone that suggested she had not often encountered such enlightened attitudes. "Most people find it impossible to separate a person's worth from their circumstances. Then most people are fools," Christopher replied with such conviction that Rose looked at him in surprise. "Well, true worth has nothing to do with birth or fortune, and everything to do with how one conducts oneself when tested by adversity." They had reached the narrow street where Rose's lodgings were located, a respectable if modest area that housed the city's working poor. Christopher noted the way she hesitated before indicating her destination, the slight flush of embarrassment that colored her cheeks as she gestured toward a building that, while clean and well-maintained, was clearly a far cry from the grand houses they had passed on their journey. "This is where I live," Rose said simply, her chin raised in a gesture of defiance against any judgment he might make. "Thank you for your escort, Your Grace. It was unexpectedly kind of you." "And Miss Whitfield," Christopher said, his voice serious as he studied her face in the lamplight, "may I ask what you do for employment? I don't mean to pry, but if you're in need of assistance—" "I work as a governess, Your Grace," Rose replied, then added with bitter honesty, or rather, I did until recently. It seems my current employer has developed concerns about my suitability for the position." "Their loss," Christopher said firmly. "Any family would be fortunate to have someone of your obvious education and refinement caring for their children." Rose stared at him in amazement, hardly able to believe that a duke, a man who moved in the highest circles of society, was speaking to her with such respect and consideration. "Your Grace, you don't know me. You don't know anything about my circumstances or my character. How can you make such judgments based on a single encounter?" "Because," Christopher said quietly, "I've spent enough time observing human nature to recognize genuine quality when I see it. You faced 3 drunken men with courage and dignity. You speak with intelligence and education, and you carry yourself with a pride that no amount of hardship has been able to break. Those are the qualities that matter, Miss Whitfield, not the circumstances that have temporarily reduced your station." As Rose climbed the narrow stairs to her small room, her mind reeling from the unexpected encounter, she found herself wondering if perhaps her luck was finally beginning to change. For the first time in 7 years, she had met someone who seemed to see her as a person of worth, rather than as a burden to be endured or a problem to be solved. But experience had taught her to be cautious about hope, and she knew better than to expect that a single act of kindness from a powerful man would fundamentally alter her circumstances. Still, as she prepared for bed in her tiny room, Rose found herself thinking about grey eyes that had looked at her with respect rather than pity, and a voice that had spoken to her as though she were a lady worthy of consideration. Perhaps, she thought as sleep finally claimed her, there were still good men in the world, men who understood that true nobility had nothing to do with titles and everything to do with character. The question was whether such a man would ever have reason to think of her again, or whether their encounter would remain nothing more than a brief moment of kindness in an otherwise difficult life. The unexpected offer. Rose woke the next morning to the sound of rain pattering against her single window, the grey light filtering through the thin curtains matching her mood as she contemplated the task of finding new employment. She had saved enough money to pay her rent for another month, but after that, her options would become increasingly limited and desperate. She was preparing to venture out to the employment agencies that catered to women in her position when a knock at her door interrupted her morning routine. Rose opened it to find a young man in livery standing in the narrow hallway, his presence so unexpected in her humble lodgings that for a moment she wondered if he had made a mistake. "Miss Rose Whitfield?" the servant asked, consulting a piece of paper in his hand. Yes, Rose replied cautiously, her mind immediately jumping to the possibility that her former employer had sent someone to make accusations about her character or demand the return of some imagined property. "And I have a message for you from His Grace the Duke of Vale," the young man said, offering her a sealed letter bearing an impressive coat of arms. "I'm instructed to wait for your reply." Rose accepted the letter with hands that trembled slightly, her mind racing as she tried to imagine what the Duke could possibly want with her. She broke the seal and unfolded the heavy paper, her eyes widening as she read the contents. "Miss Whitfield, I hope this letter finds you well. After our encounter last evening, I found myself reflecting on our conversation and your current circumstances. It occurs to me that I may be able to offer you a position that would be more suitable to your obvious education and refinement than the situations you have previously been forced to accept. My estate, Vale Manor, is in need of a companion for my ward, Miss Emma Thornton, who is 16 years old and in want of guidance as she prepares for her debut into society. The position would provide comfortable accommodation, a generous salary, and the opportunity to work with a young lady who would benefit greatly from your influence. If this arrangement interests you, I would be pleased to discuss the details at your convenience. Please inform my messenger of your decision, and if you are amenable to the proposal, a carriage will be sent to collect you at whatever time suits your schedule. I remain, with the greatest respect, Christopher Vale." Duke of Vale Rose read the letter 3 times, hardly able to believe what she was seeing. A position as companion to a duke's ward, with comfortable accommodation and generous salary. It was beyond anything she had dared to hope for, so far beyond her current circumstances that she found herself wondering if it could possibly be real. "Miss," the messenger prompted gently, "His Grace is waiting for your response." Please tell His Grace," Rose said, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart, "that I would be honored to discuss his proposal. I can be ready to depart within the hour." "Very good, miss. I'll return with a carriage shortly." As Rose hastily packed her few belongings, her mind churned with questions and possibilities. Why would the Duke offer her such a position based on a single meeting? What were his true motives? And most importantly, was she making a terrible mistake by accepting help from a man she barely knew? But as she looked around her tiny room, at the mending basket that represented her only source of income, and the meager possessions that constituted her entire worldly wealth, Rose realized that she had little choice but to take the risk. Whatever the Duke's motives, the position he was offering represented an opportunity to escape the precarious existence that had been her reality for 7 years. The carriage that arrived to collect her was elegant, but not ostentatious, its interior comfortable without being luxurious. As they traveled through the streets of London toward the Duke's townhouse, Rose found herself rehearsing what she would say, how she would present herself, what questions she should ask about the position. Vale House was an imposing Georgian mansion in one of London's most fashionable squares, its classical facade speaking to centuries of wealth and influence. Rose was shown into an elegant morning room where Duke Christopher Vale waited, dressed in a perfectly tailored coat of dark blue wool that emphasized his commanding presence. "Miss Whitfield," he said, rising to greet her with the same courtesy he had shown the previous evening. "Thank you for coming. Please sit down. Would you care for tea?" "Thank you, Your Grace," Rose replied, settling into the offered chair and trying not to be overwhelmed by the opulence of her surroundings. "I confess myself curious about the position you mentioned in your letter." "Of course," Christopher said, taking the chair across from her. "Let me explain the situation. My ward, Emma Thornton, is the daughter of my late friend, Colonel Thornton, who died in the Peninsular Campaign. Before his death, he asked me to serve as guardian to his daughter, ensuring her education and eventual introduction to society. And Miss Thornton is currently 16 years old, intelligent, spirited, and in desperate need of guidance from someone who understands the complexities of navigating society as a young woman," Christopher replied. "She has been educated by a series of governesses, but none have been able to provide the kind of sophisticated understanding of social expectations that she will need for her debut." Rose nodded, beginning to understand the nature of the challenge. "And you believe I possess such understanding?" "For I believe," Christopher said carefully, "that you have navigated circumstances that would have broken someone of lesser character. You understand both the privileges and the perils of social position, the importance of maintaining dignity in difficult situations, and the value of education and refinement. These are precisely the qualities Emma needs to see modeled. Your Grace, Rose said, her voice quiet but steady. I must ask why you would offer such a position to someone you met under such unusual circumstances. Surely you have access to companions with impeccable references and unquestionable backgrounds. Christopher was silent for a moment, considering his answer. Miss Whitfield, I have met many women with impeccable references and unquestionable backgrounds. Most of them have never faced real adversity, never been tested by circumstances beyond their control, never had to rely on their own strength and character for survival. Emma has lost her parents, been uprooted from everything familiar, and must now learn to make her way in a world that can be cruel to those it perceives as vulnerable. I believe she needs a companion who understands such challenges from personal experience. Rose felt tears prick her eyes at his words, moved by his understanding of what she had endured and his recognition that her experiences might actually be valuable rather than shameful. And the terms of employment. You would live at Vale Manor, my estate in Surrey, with your own suite of rooms and complete independence in your personal time. Your salary would be £50 per year, plus allowances for clothing and personal expenses. You would take your meals with the family, accompany Emma to social events as appropriate, and have access to the estate's library and grounds for your own enjoyment. The terms were so generous that Rose felt momentarily dizzy. £50 per year was more than she had ever earned, and the prospect of living in comfort with her own rooms and access to a library seemed almost too good to be true. Your Grace, she said carefully, these terms are extraordinarily generous. I feel compelled to ask, what do you expect in return? Beyond my duties to Miss Thornton, I mean. Christopher's grey eyes met hers directly, and she saw nothing but sincerity in their depths. I expect you to be yourself, Miss Whitfield, to provide Emma with the kind of guidance and companionship that will help her develop into a woman of character and substance, nothing more, nothing less. And if I prove unsuitable, if Miss Thornton and I do not suit each other, then we will address that situation if and when it arises, Christopher replied. But I have a feeling that you and Emma will suit each other very well indeed. Rose took a deep breath, knowing that she was about to make a decision that would change the entire course of her life. Your Grace, I accept your offer. When would you like me to begin? Immediately, if you're willing, Christopher said, his relief evident. We can travel to Vale Manor this afternoon, and you can meet Emma this evening. As they made the journey to Surrey in Christopher's comfortable carriage, Rose found herself studying her new employer with growing curiosity. He was unlike any aristocrat she had ever encountered. Direct without being rude, authoritative without being arrogant, and possessed of a moral certainty that seemed to guide his every action. May I ask you something, Your Grace? Rose said as they travelled through the countryside. Of course. Why do you care so much about doing right by Miss Thornton? Many guardians would simply provide for their ward's material needs and consider their duty fulfilled. Christopher was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape. Because I know what it's like to feel abandoned and alone, Miss Whitfield. I know what it's like to have your world turned upside down by circumstances beyond your control. I wouldn't wish such feelings on anyone, least of all a child who has already lost so much. But you speak as though from personal experience. Perhaps because I do, Christopher replied, then seemed to shake off whatever memory had darkened his expression. But that's a story for another time. Tell me, what do you think would be the most important thing for Emma to learn as she prepares for her debut? That her worth as a person has nothing to do with society's opinion of her, Rose said without hesitation. That true confidence comes from knowing who you are and what you value, not from the approval of others. Christopher smiled, and Rose felt her heart skip a beat at the warmth in his expression. I knew I was right about you, Miss Whitfield. Emma is going to benefit enormously from your influence. As Vale Manor came into view, a magnificent Palladian mansion set in grounds that seemed to stretch to the horizon, Rose felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. She was about to begin a new chapter of her life, one that offered opportunities she had never dared to imagine. But she was also acutely aware that she was entering the world of a man who had already shown her more kindness and respect than she had received in years, and she found herself wondering if her feelings toward her employer might prove to be more complicated than simple gratitude. The Duke had indeed changed her fate, but Rose was beginning to suspect that he might change her heart as well, a possibility that was both thrilling and terrifying for a woman who had learned to guard her emotions as carefully as she guarded her few material possessions. Vale Manor, Vale Manor rose from the Surrey countryside like something from a fairy tale, its honey-coloured stone glowing in the afternoon sunlight and its perfectly proportioned facade speaking to centuries of wealth, taste, and aristocratic privilege. As their carriage swept up the long drive lined with ancient oak trees, Rose felt her breath catch at the sheer scale and beauty of what was to be her new home. "It's magnificent," she said softly, unable to keep the wonder from her voice. "It's been in my family for over 200 years, Christopher replied, though there was no boastfulness in his tone, merely the quiet pride of a man who understood his responsibilities as a custodian of such heritage. "I hope you'll be comfortable here, Miss Whitfield. I want you to think of it as your home for as long as you remain with us." The interior of the manor was even more impressive than its exterior, with soaring ceilings, magnificent paintings, and furnishings that spoke to generations of refined taste. But what struck Rose most was the warmth of the atmosphere. Despite its grandeur, Vale Manor felt like a home rather than a museum, lived in and loved rather than merely displayed. "Your Grace," a distinguished-looking man in butler's livery approached as they entered the main hall. "Welcome home. I trust your journey was comfortable." "Indeed it was, Harrison. Miss Whitfield, may I present Mr. Harrison, who manages the household with remarkable efficiency. Harrison, this is Miss Rose Whitfield, who will be serving as companion to Miss Emma." "Was Miss Whitfield," Harrison said, offering a respectful bow. "We're delighted to welcome you to Vale Manor. I've prepared the blue suite for your accommodation, and I believe you'll find it quite comfortable." "Thank you, Mr. Harrison," Rose replied, touched by the warmth of his greeting. "I'm looking forward to meeting Miss Emma." "Ah, speaking of whom," Harrison said with a slight smile, "I believe Miss Emma is currently in the library, where she has been awaiting your arrival with what I can only describe as barely contained excitement." Christopher led Rose through a series of elegant corridors to a magnificent library that seemed to contain more books than Rose had seen in her entire life. Floor-to-ceiling shelves stretched in every direction, filled with leather-bound volumes that spoke to generations of scholarly interests and intellectual curiosity. "Emma!" Christopher called out as they entered the vast room. "I'd like you to meet Miss Whitfield." The young woman emerged from behind one of the tall stacks, and Rose's first impression was of barely contained energy and intelligence. Emma Thornton was indeed 16, with dark hair that seemed determined to escape from its pins, bright blue eyes that sparkled with curiosity, and a face that promised great beauty once she grew into her features. "Miss Whitfield," Emma exclaimed, hurrying forward with an enthusiasm that was both charming and slightly overwhelming. "I'm so pleased to meet you. Uncle Christopher told me you were coming, and I've been simply dying of curiosity. Are you really going to be my companion? Will you help me prepare for my debut? Do you know anything about dancing? I'm absolutely hopeless at it, and I'm terrified I'll disgrace myself at my first ball." "Emma," Christopher said gently, though his tone was warm with affection, "perhaps you might allow Miss Whitfield to catch her breath before subjecting her to interrogation." "Oh, I'm sorry," Emma said, though her smile suggested she was not particularly repentant. "I'm just so excited to finally have someone to talk to who understands what it's like to be a young woman. Uncle Christopher is wonderful, of course, but he's hardly an expert on the complexities of female society." Rose found herself smiling at Emma's irrepressible enthusiasm. "I'm delighted to meet you too, Miss Emma. And yes, I do know something about dancing, though I suspect your skills are better than you believe. Would you like to see your rooms?" Emma asked eagerly. "Uncle Christopher had them specially prepared for you, and they're absolutely lovely. You have your own sitting room and everything." The blue suite proved to be more luxurious than any accommodation Rose had ever enjoyed, with elegant furnishings, a comfortable sitting area, and windows that overlooked the manor's beautiful gardens. After years of tiny, cramped rooms with poor light and inadequate heating, the spacious elegance of her new quarters seemed almost overwhelming. "I hope you'll be comfortable here," Christopher said, as Emma continued her enthusiastic tour of the rooms. "If there's anything you need, anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask." "Yes, Your Grace," Rose said quietly. "This is far more than I expected. You've been extraordinarily generous." "Nonsense," Christopher replied firmly. "You're providing an invaluable service to my family. It's only right that you should be comfortable while doing so." That evening, Rose joined Christopher and Emma for dinner in an intimate dining room that, while still grand by most standards, felt cozy and welcoming compared to the formal staterooms she had glimpsed during her tour of the manor. The conversation flowed easily, with Emma peppering Rose with questions about her experiences and Christopher contributing observations that revealed both his intelligence and his genuine care for his ward. "Miss Whitfield," Emma said as they enjoyed the final course, "Rowler's Uncle Christopher mentioned that you've worked as a governess. What was that like? Were the families kind to you?" Rose hesitated, uncertain how much of her experiences she should share with someone so young and sheltered. "It varied considerably," she said finally. "Some families were kind, others less so, but it taught me a great deal about resilience and the importance of maintaining one's dignity regardless of circumstances. I think people who work for their living are often much more interesting than people who don't," Emma declared with the confidence of youth. "They understand the world in ways that those of us born to privilege simply cannot." "That's a very mature observation," Christopher said, his approval evident. "Though I hope you'll remember that privilege brings responsibilities as well as advantages." "Oh, I know that," Emma replied seriously. "You've made certain I understand my obligations to the tenants and the community, but I still think there's value in understanding how the other half lives." After dinner, Christopher excused himself to attend to estate business, leaving Rose and Emma alone in the drawing room. Emma immediately curled up in a chair near the fire, her formal dinner demeanor giving way to the natural enthusiasm of a 16-year-old. "Miss Whitfield," she said, "may I speak frankly?" "Oh, of course," Rose replied, settling into her own chair and preparing herself for whatever revelation was coming. "I'm terrified about my debut," Emma confessed, her earlier confidence evaporating. "I know I'm supposed to be excited about balls and parties and meeting eligible gentlemen, but the truth is I have no idea how to behave in society. I've been educated here at Vale Manor, with only occasional visits to London, and I'm afraid I'll say or do something that will embarrass Uncle Christopher." Rose felt her heart go out to the young woman, recognizing in Emma's fears echoes of her own anxieties about navigating social situations where one wrong move could have devastating consequences. "Emma, she said gently, "may I tell you something? The most important thing about succeeding in society is not knowing all the rules. It's being genuinely interested in other people and treating everyone with kindness and respect. If you do that, people will forgive any minor mistakes in etiquette." "But what if they don't like me?" Emma asked, her voice small. "What if I'm too bookish, or too opinionated, or just not what they expect from a young lady of quality?" "Then they're not worthy of your concern," Rose replied firmly. "Emma, you're intelligent, kind, and possessed of a natural warmth that draws people to you. Any society worth joining will recognize and value those qualities." "Do you really think so?" Emma asked hopefully. "I know so," Rose said with conviction. "And besides, you have something many young ladies lack. A guardian who values your mind as much as your accomplishments, who wants you to be happy rather than simply marriageable." "Uncle Christopher is wonderful," Emma agreed, her face lighting up. "But he's nothing like what I expected when Papa told me I would be going to live with him. I thought he would be stern and distant, but he's been so kind, so patient with all my questions and interests." "He clearly cares for you very much," Rose observed, thinking of the warmth she had seen in Christopher's eyes when he looked at his ward. He does," Emma said softly, "and I hope you'll be happy here, Miss Whitfield. Uncle Christopher seems different since you arrived, lighter somehow, as though he's been carrying a burden and has finally found someone to help him bear it." Rose felt her cheeks warm at Emma's observation, wondering if her own reaction to the Duke was as obvious as his apparent reaction to her. "I'm sure His Grace is simply pleased to have found a suitable companion for you." "Perhaps," Emma said with a knowing smile that seemed far too sophisticated for her 16 years. "But I think it's more than that. I think you've reminded him that there's more to life than duty and responsibility." As Rose prepared for bed that night in her beautiful new rooms, she found herself reflecting on Emma's words and wondering if there might be truth in the young woman's observations. Certainly, she had felt something during her interactions with Christopher, a connection that went beyond gratitude for his kindness or respect for his principles. But she was also acutely aware of the vast gulf between their stations, the impossibility of any relationship beyond that of employer and employee. She was a woman who had been cast out by her own family, who had survived by her wits and her willingness to work, who brought nothing to any relationship except her character and her determination. Christopher was a duke, a man of immense wealth and influence, who could have his choice of the most beautiful and accomplished women in England. What could he possibly see in someone like her beyond a convenient solution to his ward's need for companionship? Yet as she drifted off to sleep in the most comfortable bed she had known in years, Rose found herself hoping that perhaps Emma was right, that perhaps she had indeed brought something valuable into Christopher's life, something that went beyond her usefulness as a companion to his ward. The possibility was both thrilling and terrifying, offering the promise of happiness she had never dared to imagine, while threatening to expose her heart to a pain that might prove unbearable if her hopes proved unfounded. But for the first time in 7 years, Rose fell asleep feeling truly safe and valued, surrounded by beauty and comfort, and cared for by people who seemed to see her as more than just a burden to be endured or a problem to be solved. Whatever the future held, she was no longer alone in the world, and that knowledge was worth any risk her heart might face. Growing attachments. The weeks that followed Rose's arrival at Vale Manor passed with a swiftness that surprised her, each day bringing new discoveries about her charges and her own capacity for happiness. Emma proved to be everything Christopher had promised: intelligent, spirited, and eager to learn, but also possessed of a warmth and humor that made their lessons feel more like conversations between friends than formal instruction. "Miss Whitfield," Emma said one morning, as they practiced the intricate steps of a country dance in the Manor's elegant ballroom, "do you think it's terribly unfeminine of me to prefer books to embroidery?" "Not at all," Rose replied, adjusting Emma's posture with gentle hands. "Though I do think it's important to be accomplished in both intellectual and domestic arts. A lady who can discuss philosophy with equal facility as she can manage a household will never lack for interesting company." "Is that how you became so accomplished?" Emma asked, executing a particularly complex turn with growing confidence. "Your education seems far superior to what most governesses receive." Rose felt the familiar tightness in her chest that always accompanied questions about her past, but she had grown comfortable enough with Emma to share at least part of her story. "I was fortunate to have an excellent governess when I was young, and parents who believed that education was the greatest gift they could give their daughter. And then your circumstances changed," Emma prompted gently, her blue eyes warm with sympathy rather than curiosity. "Yes," Rose said simply, "but I've learned that circumstances are temporary, while education and character are permanent. No one can take away what you've learned or who you've chosen to become." "Well, Uncle Christopher says something similar," Emma observed. "He says that true nobility comes from one's actions, not one's birth." "Your uncle is a wise man," Rose replied, trying to keep her voice neutral despite the way her heart always skipped when Christopher's name was mentioned. "He's also quite taken with you," Emma said with the directness of youth. I've never seen him pay such attention to anyone before." Rose felt heat flood her cheeks. "Emma, you mustn't say such things. His Grace is simply being kind to someone in his employ." "And is he?" Emma asked with a knowing smile. "Then why does he find excuses to join us for our lessons? Why does he ask my opinion about your comfort and happiness at least once a day? And why does he look at you the way Papa used to look at Mama when he thought no one was watching?" Before Rose could formulate a response to these unsettling observations, Christopher himself appeared in the ballroom doorway, as though summoned by their conversation. He was dressed for riding, his tall frame shown to advantage in a perfectly tailored coat of dark green wool, and his grey eyes immediately sought out Rose's face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Good morning, ladies," he said, his voice warm with genuine pleasure at seeing them. "I hope I'm not interrupting your lesson." "Not at all, Uncle Christopher," Emma replied with suspicious innocence. "We were just discussing the importance of education and character. Miss Whitfield has been sharing some very enlightening perspectives." "I'm certain she has," Christopher said, his gaze lingering on Rose's face in a way that made her acutely aware of her appearance. "Miss Whitfield, I wonder if you might join me for a walk in the gardens when your lesson is complete. There's a matter I'd like to discuss with you." "Of course, Your Grace," Rose replied, though her mind immediately began racing with possibilities about what he might want to discuss. Had she overstepped some boundary? Made some error in Emma's education? Failed to meet his expectations in some way? An hour later, Rose found herself walking beside Christopher through the magnificent gardens of Vale Manor. The autumn air crisp and invigorating, the landscape painted in shades of gold and crimson that took her breath away. They walked in comfortable silence for several minutes before Christopher spoke. "I wanted to thank you," he said, his voice serious. "The change in Emma since your arrival has been remarkable. She's more confident, more poised, but also happier than I've seen her since she came to live with me." Emma is a remarkable young woman, Rose replied. She simply needed someone to help her see her own worth and potential. As did someone else I know, Christopher said quietly, and there was something in his tone that made Rose look at him sharply. Your Grace. Christopher stopped walking and turned to face her, his grey eyes intense as they searched her face. Rose, may I speak plainly? The use of her given name sent a thrill through her that she tried desperately to suppress. Of course. When I first encountered you that night in London, I saw a woman of obvious breeding and education who had been reduced to circumstances far beneath her station. I offered you this position because I believed you could help Emma, and you have exceeded my expectations in that regard. But I must confess that my motives were not entirely altruistic. Rose felt her heart begin to race, though whether from hope or fear she couldn't say. What do you mean? I mean that I was drawn to you from that first meeting, drawn to your courage, your dignity, your refusal to be broken by circumstances that would have defeated someone of lesser character. I told myself that my interest was purely professional, that I was simply recognizing quality where others had failed to see it. But I can no longer pretend that my feelings are so simple. Your Grace, Rose whispered, her voice barely audible. You cannot mean... Or I mean that I've fallen in love with you, Christopher said simply, his words falling between them like stones dropped into still water. I love your intelligence, your strength, your kindness, and the way you've brought light and warmth into this house. I love watching you with Emma, seeing the way you nurture her confidence while challenging her to grow. I love the sound of your laughter, the way your eyes light up when you discuss something that interests you, the grace with which you've handled every challenge life has thrown at you. Rose stared at him in shock, her mind reeling from the impossibility of what she was hearing. But that is, you're a duke, and you're a woman of exceptional character and worth, Christopher interrupted firmly. Your birth, your current circumstances, your lack of fortune, none of those things matter to me. What matters is who you are, what you've made of yourself despite adversity, and how you make me feel when I'm with you. But society be damned, Christopher said with a vehemence that surprised them both. I've spent my entire life doing what society expected, marrying whom I was told to marry, living according to rules I had no part in making. My first marriage was a union of convenience that brought me neither happiness nor companionship, merely the fulfillment of duty. I will not make that mistake again. Rose felt tears streaming down her face as she struggled to process the magnitude of what he was saying. Christopher, you don't understand what you're asking. If we were to, the scandal would destroy you. Your position, your influence, your ability to provide for Emma, all of it would be at risk. And if I don't take this chance, Christopher replied, reaching out to gently cup her face in his hands, I'll spend the rest of my life regretting the loss of the only woman I've ever truly loved. Rose, I'm not asking you to decide anything right now. I'm simply asking you to consider the possibility that love might be worth any price society demands. I need time to think, Rose said, her voice thick with emotion. This is so much more than I ever dared to hope for, but also so much more complicated than you realize. And take all the time you need, Christopher said gently. But Rose, please remember that you are worthy of love, worthy of happiness, worthy of every good thing this world has to offer. Don't let the cruelty you've experienced convince you otherwise. As they walked back to the manor in contemplative silence, Rose's mind churned with the implications of Christopher's declaration. For 7 years she had convinced herself that love was a luxury she could not afford, that her circumstances had placed her beyond the reach of such happiness. But now, faced with the possibility of a love that transcended social barriers, she found herself torn between hope and terror. That evening, as she helped Emma prepare for bed, the young woman studied her face with knowing eyes. He told you, didn't he? Emma said without preamble. Each about his feelings for you? Rose felt her cheeks burn. Emma, I don't think... Oh, don't worry, Emma said with a wave of her hand. I've known for weeks that Uncle Christopher was in love with you. The only question was when he would finally work up the courage to tell you. Emma, you must understand how impossible this situation is, Rose said, sinking into a chair beside Emma's bed. Your uncle is a duke, one of the most powerful men in England. I'm a woman who was cast out by her own family, who has survived by working as a governess and seamstress. The gulf between our stations is vast. Is it? Emma asked, her blue eyes serious despite her youth. Because from where I sit, I see two people who are perfectly matched in intelligence, kindness, and moral character. I see a man who has been lonely for years finally finding someone who makes him truly happy, and a woman who deserves every bit of love and security he can offer her. But the scandal will be temporary, Emma interrupted, with the confidence of someone who had never faced social ostracism. Uncle Christopher has enough wealth and influence to weather any storm, and once people see how happy you make each other, how well suited you are, they'll accept the match. Rose wished she could share Emma's optimism, but years of experience had taught her that society's prejudices ran deep and forgiveness came slowly, if at all. Emma, you don't understand what it's like to be truly cast out, to have doors closed in your face simply because of circumstances beyond your control. I won't be responsible for bringing such treatment upon your uncle. And what about your happiness? Emma asked quietly. Don't you deserve love, Miss Whitfield? Don't you deserve to be cherished and protected and valued for who you are, rather than what you can provide? The question hit Rose like a physical blow, forcing her to confront desires she had buried so deeply that she had almost convinced herself they didn't exist. I don't know if I remember how to hope for such things. Then perhaps it's time to learn, Emma said gently. Miss Whitfield, Rose, you've taught me so much about courage and dignity and standing up for what's right. Now maybe it's time to apply those lessons to your own life. Over the following days, Rose found herself caught in an emotional maelstrom, her feelings swinging between hope and despair as she contemplated the impossible choice before her. Christopher, to his credit, made no attempt to pressure her for an answer, though she was acutely aware of his presence whenever they were in the same room, of the way his eyes followed her movements, of the careful restraint he exercised to avoid making her uncomfortable. It was during one of her solitary walks in the garden that Rose encountered Mrs. Harrison, the housekeeper, who had been observing the household dynamics with the shrewd eye of someone who had served the Vale family for over 30 years. Miss Whitfield, the older woman said, falling into step beside Rose as she wandered among the autumn flowers. Might I have a word? Of course, Mrs. Harrison, Rose replied, though she suspected she knew what the conversation would entail. I've been watching you and His Grace these past weeks, Mrs. Harrison said without preamble, and I've been watching the effect you've had on this household. Miss Emma is blooming under your guidance, and His Grace, well, I haven't seen him this happy since before his first marriage. Rose felt her cheeks warm. Mrs. Harrison, I'm not certain what you're implying. I'm not implying anything, my dear. I'm stating plainly that His Grace is in love with you, and unless I'm much mistaken, you return his feelings. Even if that were true, Rose said quietly, surely you must see how impossible such a situation would be. The difference in our stations means nothing to those of us who know His Grace's character, Mrs. Harrison interrupted firmly. Miss Whitfield, I've served this family for 3 decades. I've seen His Grace marry for duty, watched him fulfill every obligation society placed upon him, observed him sacrifice his own happiness time and again for the sake of propriety. Don't you think he deserves the chance to choose love for once in his life? But the scandal will pass, Mrs. Harrison said with conviction. Scandals always do. But love, true love, is rare and precious, and those who are fortunate enough to find it shouldn't let fear keep them from claiming it. You speak as though from experience, Rose observed. Mrs. Harrison smiled, her expression growing soft with memory. I do indeed. I married beneath my station, you know. My family disowned me for choosing a butler over the gentleman they had selected for me. It was difficult at first, facing their disapproval, losing their support. But I've had 40 years of happiness with a man who loves me for who I am, rather than what I can bring to his position. I've never regretted my choice, not for a single day. And if His Grace were to face similar consequences, if his family, his peers, his political allies were to turn against him, then he would face them with you by his side, Mrs. Harrison replied simply. And that would make him stronger, not weaker. Miss Whitfield, you've brought something to this house that's been missing for years. Joy, warmth, the sense that it's a home rather than merely a grand estate. Don't let fear rob His Grace of the happiness he's found with you. That evening, Rose found herself in the library, seeking solace among the books that had always been her refuge in times of uncertainty. She was so absorbed in her reading that she didn't notice Christopher's approach until he spoke her name softly. Rose, I hope I'm not disturbing you. She looked up to find him standing nearby, his expression gentle but serious, and her heart immediately began racing. Not at all, Your Grace. I was simply thinking about us, he asked quietly, settling into the chair across from hers. Among other things, Rose admitted, closing her book and setting it aside. Christopher, I need to tell you something about my past. Something that might change how you feel about this situation. Nothing could change how I feel about you, Christopher said firmly. But Rose held up a hand to stop him. Please, let me finish. You deserve to know the truth before you make any decisions about your future. Rose took a deep breath, steeling herself to share the painful details she had kept hidden for so long. My father was Sir William Whitfield, a gentleman of modest means but good reputation. When I was 16, he arranged a marriage for me with the son of a neighbouring family, a young man named Lord Pemberton. Christopher's expression darkened at the familiar name, but he remained silent, allowing her to continue. The engagement was announced, the wedding planned, everything seemed settled. But then, my father made some disastrous investments, lost everything we had, and took his own life, rather than face the shame of bankruptcy. Rose's voice broke slightly, but she forced herself to continue. Lord Pemberton immediately broke our engagement, claiming that he could not marry into a family touched by such scandal. His mother, Lady Pemberton, made certain that the story was spread throughout society, ensuring that I would never be accepted in polite circles again. Rose, Christopher said softly, his voice filled with compassion and growing anger on her behalf. My guardian, my father's cousin, took me in reluctantly, but when he remarried, his new wife decided that I was an embarrassment to the family. I was given a small sum of money and told to make my own way in the world. I was 17 years old, with no family, no fortune, and a reputation that made me unemployable in any respectable household. How did you survive? Christopher asked, though his tone suggested he was beginning to understand the full extent of what she had endured. By hiding my identity, taking positions under an assumed name, moving frequently to avoid recognition. I've spent 7 years living in fear that someone would discover who I really am and expose me, that I would lose whatever precarious security I had managed to build. Christopher was silent for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what she had shared. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Rose, I am so sorry for what you've endured. No one should have to face such cruelty, such abandonment, especially not someone so young and vulnerable. Do you see now why this is impossible? Rose asked, tears streaming down her face. I'm not just a woman of modest background. I'm someone who has been publicly disgraced, cast out by society, marked as unsuitable for any respectable association. If you were to marry me, you would be allying yourself with scandal and shame. No, Christopher said firmly, rising from his chair to kneel beside hers, taking her hands in his with gentle strength. If I were to marry you, I would be allying myself with courage, resilience, and a strength of character that humbles me. Rose, what happened to you was not your fault. You were a child, victimized by circumstances beyond your control, and abandoned by people who should have protected you. The shame belongs to them, not to you. But society will never see it that way. Then society is wrong, Christopher interrupted, with a vehemence that surprised them both. Rose, I've spent my entire adult life doing what society expected, following rules that often made no sense, sacrificing my own happiness for the sake of appearances. I will not do it again. I will not let the prejudices of small-minded people keep me from the woman I love. Christopher, Rose whispered, her heart breaking at the certainty in his voice, the absolute conviction that love could conquer any obstacle. Marry me, he said suddenly, his grey eyes blazing with determination. Marry me, Rose, and let the world say what it will. I have enough wealth to ensure our security, enough influence to protect us from the worst of society's cruelty, and enough love to make up for any hardships we might face. You don't know what you're asking, Rose protested, even as her heart soared at his words. The scandal would be enormous. Your political career, your social standing, your ability to help people through your position, all of it would be at risk. And what good are any of those things if I'm miserable without you? Christopher countered. Rose, I've had wealth, position, and influence for years, but I've never been truly happy until you came into my life. You've shown me what it means to live rather than merely exist, to love rather than simply fulfill obligations. But Emma wants nothing more than to see us happy together, Christopher said with a slight smile. She's been campaigning for this match since the day you arrived. Rose, please don't let fear keep us from the happiness we've found together. Don't let the cruelty of others convince you that you're not worthy of love. Rose looked into his eyes and saw not just love, but absolute certainty. A conviction so strong that it began to chip away at the walls of fear and self-doubt she had built around her heart. Christopher, if we do this, if we marry, there will be no going back. Once the scandal breaks, once society learns who I really am, we'll be committed to facing whatever consequences follow. Then we'll face them together, Christopher said simply. Rose, I would rather spend my life as a social pariah with you by my side than live in the highest circles of society without you. You are worth any sacrifice, any struggle, any price the world might demand. And if you come to regret your choice, if the isolation becomes too much, if you begin to resent what our marriage has cost you? Impossible, Christopher said with absolute conviction. Rose, you are the best thing that has ever happened to me. You've brought light into my life, purpose to my days, and joy to my heart. I could never regret choosing you. As Rose looked into his eyes, seeing the depth of his love and the strength of his commitment, she felt the last of her resistance crumble. Perhaps Emma and Mrs. Harrison were right. Perhaps love really was worth fighting for, worth risking everything to claim. Yes, she whispered, the word barely audible but carrying the weight of a decision that would change both their lives forever. Yes, Christopher repeated, his voice filled with wonder and joy. Yes, I'll marry you, Rose said more firmly, her voice growing stronger with each word. I love you, Christopher, more than I ever thought possible. I love your kindness, your integrity, your willingness to see worth where others see only scandal. If you're truly willing to face whatever comes, then yes, I'll be your wife. Christopher's response was to pull her into his arms and kiss her with a passion that spoke to months of restrained longing, a kiss that promised a future filled with love, challenge, and the kind of happiness that came from choosing each other against all odds. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had just committed to, Christopher rested his forehead against hers and smiled. We're going to face opposition, he said quietly. There will be those who try to convince us that we're making a mistake, that love isn't enough to overcome the obstacles in our path. Then we'll prove them wrong, Rose replied, with a confidence that surprised her. We'll show them that true love, when it's built on mutual respect and shared values, can indeed conquer all. Together? Christopher asked, his voice warm with love and promise. Together, Rose confirmed, and as he kissed her again, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the man she loved by her side, and that would make all the difference in the world. The Duke had indeed changed her fate, transforming her from a woman cast out and abandoned into a beloved Duchess-to-be, proving that sometimes the greatest love stories began with the most unlikely encounters, and that true nobility had nothing to do with birth and everything to do with the courage to choose love over fear. The announcement. The weeks that followed their engagement were a whirlwind of preparation and anticipation, as Christopher set about making arrangements for their wedding, while carefully managing the delicate process of announcing their betrothal to society. He was determined to present their union in the best possible light, to emphasize Rose's qualities and character rather than her unfortunate past, and to use his considerable influence to smooth their path as much as possible. I've spoken with the Archbishop, Christopher told Rose one morning, as they walked through the gardens with Emma, who had been practically glowing with excitement since learning of their engagement. He's agreed to perform the ceremony here at Vale Manor, which will allow us to control the guest list and avoid some of the more challenging aspects of a London wedding. That's very thoughtful, Rose replied, though she could hear the underlying tension in his voice. Have you told your family yet? Christopher's expression grew more serious. I've written to my mother and my sister. I expect to hear from them soon, and I suspect their initial reactions will be mixed. Mixed is a diplomatic way of putting it, Emma observed with the directness of youth. I imagine they'll be shocked, possibly horrified, and definitely full of objections. Emma, Christopher said warningly, though his tone was more amused than angry. Well, it's true, isn't it? Emma replied unrepentantly. But they'll come around once they meet Rose properly, once they see how happy she makes you and how perfectly suited you are to each other. Rose wished she could share Emma's confidence, but she had learned to be realistic about society's capacity for forgiveness. Christopher, perhaps we should prepare for the possibility that your family won't accept our marriage. I don't want to come between you and the people you love. You won't, Christopher said firmly, taking her hand in his as they paused beside a fountain surrounded by late-blooming roses. If my family cannot see your worth, if they cannot accept the woman I've chosen to spend my life with, then that's their loss, not ours. But surely, Rose, Christopher interrupted gently, I've made my choice. I've chosen you, chosen our future together, and I won't be swayed by anyone's disapproval, no matter how closely related to me they might be. The first test of Christopher's resolve came 3 days later, when his mother, the Dowager Duchess of Vale, arrived at the manor without warning, her travelling coach sweeping up the drive with an urgency that suggested she had made the journey from London in record time. "She's here," Emma announced, peering out the window of the morning room where she and Rose had been reviewing the guest list for the wedding. "And she looks formidable." Rose felt her stomach clench with anxiety as she watched the elegant figure of the Dowager Duchess emerge from her carriage, every line of her posture radiating aristocratic authority and barely controlled displeasure. At 62, she was still a handsome woman, with silver hair arranged in a severe style and sharp blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Perhaps I should make myself scarce," Rose suggested, rising from her chair with hands that trembled slightly. "Allow you and His Grace to speak with her privately." "Absolutely not," Emma said firmly, catching Rose's arm to prevent her from leaving. "You're going to be part of this family, which means you don't run and hide when things get difficult. Besides, grandmother needs to see that you're not some scheming fortune hunter, but a woman of character and dignity." Before Rose could protest further, Christopher appeared in the doorway, his expression carefully controlled, but his grey eyes warm with reassurance as they met hers. "My mother has arrived," he said unnecessarily. "She's requested to meet with me privately, but I've told her that any conversation about my future wife will include my future wife." "Christopher, perhaps it would be better," Rose began, but he shook his head firmly. "We face this together, remember? You're not a servant to be dismissed, or a problem to be discussed in your absence. You're the woman I love, and you deserve to be treated with the respect due to that position." The meeting took place in the formal drawing room, with its imposing portraits of Vale ancestors looking down from the walls like silent judges. The Dowager Duchess sat ramrod straight in her chair, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Rose's appearance and demeanour with the thoroughness of a general assessing enemy forces. "Christopher," she began without preamble, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "I received your letter announcing your intention to marry this person. I assume this is some sort of jest, or perhaps a temporary madness brought on by isolation in the country." "Mother," Christopher replied with careful courtesy, "may I present Miss Rose Whitfield, my fiancée? Rose, this is my mother, the Dowager Duchess of Vale." Rose rose and executed a perfect curtsy, her years of training serving her well despite her nervousness. "Your Grace, I'm honored to meet you." The Dowager Duchess studied Rose with the intensity of a scientist examining a particularly interesting specimen. "Miss Whitfield, I confess myself curious about your background, your family, your circumstances. Surely my son has not taken leave of his senses entirely." "Mother," Christopher said, his voice carrying a warning, but Rose placed a gentle hand on his arm. "It's quite all right," she said quietly. "Your Grace, I understand your concerns about your son's choice of bride. My background is complicated, and I'm certain you've heard stories that cast doubt on my suitability for such a position." "Indeed I have," the Dowager Duchess replied coolly. "Stories of scandal, disgrace, and social ostracism. Stories that suggest you are hardly the appropriate choice for a man of my son's position." Rose felt the familiar pain of old wounds being reopened, but she forced herself to meet the older woman's gaze directly. "Your Grace, I won't pretend that my past is without blemish, or that my circumstances haven't been reduced. But I will say that I love your son deeply, that I would never do anything to harm his reputation or position, and that I hope to prove myself worthy of the trust he's placed in me." "Love," the Dowager Duchess repeated with obvious disdain. "How charmingly romantic. Tell me, Miss Whitfield, what exactly do you bring to this union besides your affections? What connections, what fortune, what advantages can you offer to enhance my son's position?" "Nothing," Rose replied honestly, her voice steady despite the cruelty of the question. "I bring nothing but myself, my character, my education, my commitment to your son's happiness, and my determination to be the best wife and duchess I can possibly be." "How refreshingly honest," the Dowager Duchess said, though her tone suggested she found such honesty more foolish than admirable. "Christopher, surely you can see the impossibility of this situation. The scandal alone would destroy your political career, your social standing, your ability to advance the family's interests." "Mother," Christopher said, his voice growing firmer with each word. "I've made my decision. I'm going to marry Rose, with or without your approval. I would prefer to have your blessing, but I won't sacrifice my happiness for the sake of political expediency or social convention." "And what of your duty to the family name? Your obligation to marry appropriately, to form alliances that strengthen our position rather than weaken it?" "My duty," Christopher replied with quiet conviction, "is to live with honor and integrity, to use my position to help others, and to find happiness where I can. Rose embodies all of those values, and she makes me a better man than I've ever been. That seems like exactly the kind of alliance our family should celebrate." The Dowager Duchess was silent for a long moment, her sharp eyes moving between her son and Rose with an expression that was impossible to read. Finally she spoke, her voice carefully controlled. "Miss Whitfield, would you be so kind as to join me for a private walk in the gardens? I believe there are things we should discuss without an audience." Rose felt her heart skip with anxiety, but she nodded gracefully. "Of course, Your Grace." As they walked through the formal gardens, the Dowager Duchess maintained her silence for several minutes, apparently gathering her thoughts. When she finally spoke, her voice was less hostile than it had been in the drawing room. "Miss Whitfield, I'm going to speak plainly. I've spent the past 3 days investigating your background, your family, your circumstances. I know about your father's suicide, your broken engagement, your years of working under an assumed name. I know exactly what kind of scandal my son would be inviting by marrying you." Rose felt her cheeks burn with shame, but she forced herself to respond calmly. "Then you understand why I tried to discourage his interest, why I believe this marriage may not be in his best interests. And yet you accepted his proposal." "Yes," Rose admitted quietly, "because I love him more than I've ever loved anyone, and because he convinced me that our happiness together was worth whatever challenges we might face." "Love," the Dowager Duchess said again, but this time there was less disdain in her voice. "Tell me, Miss Whitfield, what do you see when you look at my son?" The question surprised Rose, but she answered honestly. "I see a man of extraordinary character and integrity, someone who has never compromised his principles for convenience or profit. I see someone who is kind without being weak, strong without being cruel, intelligent without being condescending. I see the man I want to spend the rest of my life loving and supporting." "And what do you think he sees when he looks at you?" Rose was quiet for a moment, considering the question. I hope he sees someone who understands the weight of responsibility he carries, someone who can be his partner rather than just his ornament, someone who loves him for who he is rather than what he can provide." "An interesting perspective," the Dowager Duchess mused. "Miss Whitfield, I won't pretend that I'm pleased about this match. The scandal will be considerable, the social challenge is enormous, but I've been watching my son for the past hour, and I haven't seen him this happy since, well, perhaps ever. Your Grace? Christopher has spent his entire adult life doing his duty, fulfilling obligations, sacrificing his personal desires for the sake of family and position. His first marriage was arranged, loveless, and brought him nothing but loneliness, despite producing the heir the family required. If he's finally found someone who makes him truly happy, who am I to stand in his way?" Rose felt tears spring to her eyes at the unexpected kindness in the older woman's voice. "Does this mean, that is, would you be willing to—" "I'm willing to give you a chance," the Dowager Duchess said firmly, "to see if you can indeed be the wife and duchess my son needs. But Miss Whitfield, understand this. If you hurt him, if you prove unworthy of his trust, if you bring shame upon this family through your actions rather than your past, I will make your life very difficult indeed." "I understand," Rose replied, her voice thick with emotion. "And I promise you, Your Grace, I will spend every day of my life trying to be worthy of his love and your acceptance." "Then perhaps," the Dowager Duchess said, with the first genuine smile Rose had seen from her, "we should return to the house and begin planning a wedding. If my son is determined to create a scandal, we might as well ensure it's a magnificent one." As they walked back toward the manor, Rose felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. The Dowager Duchess's acceptance wasn't enthusiastic, but it was genuine, and it meant that Christopher wouldn't have to choose between his family and his bride. "Your Grace," Rose said as they approached the house, "may I ask you something?" "Of course." "What changed your mind? What made you decide to accept this marriage?" The Dowager Duchess paused, her expression growing thoughtful. "Two things, Miss Whitfield. First, I realized that my son's happiness is more important to me than society's approval. And second, I recognized something in you that I hadn't expected to find. What was that? Strength, the Dowager Duchess replied simply. The kind of strength that comes from surviving adversity without becoming bitter, from facing cruelty without losing compassion. Christopher will need a wife with such strength, someone who can stand beside him through whatever challenges lie ahead. I believe you might be that woman. As they entered the house to find Christopher and Emma waiting anxiously for news of their conversation, Rose felt a surge of gratitude and determination. She had been given a second chance at happiness, a family willing to accept her despite her past, and a love worth fighting for. The road ahead would not be easy. There would still be scandal, opposition, and social challenges to face. But with Christopher's love, Emma's support, and now the Dowager Duchess's grudging acceptance, Rose felt ready to face whatever the future might bring. She was no longer the abandoned girl who had been cast out 7 years ago. She was a woman who had survived, learned, and grown stronger through adversity. And soon, she would be the Duchess of Vale, ready to prove that true nobility came not from birth, but from character, and that love really could conquer all when it was supported by courage, determination, and the willingness to fight for what mattered most. 5 years later, the gardens of Vale Manor were alive with the sound of children's laughter as 4-year-old twins, Alexander and Victoria Vale, chased each other through the maze of perfectly manicured hedges, their delighted squeals echoing across the grounds where their parents had first declared their love for each other. Rose, now 38, and every inch the Duchess she had never imagined she could become, watched from her favorite bench beneath the ancient oak tree, one hand resting protectively on her rounded belly where their third child grew. "They have your determination," Christopher observed, settling beside her with the afternoon correspondence, his grey eyes warm with contentment as he watched their children play. "And your complete disregard for the concept of staying clean. They have your sense of adventure," Rose replied, leaning against her husband's shoulder with the comfortable intimacy of a couple whose love had only deepened with time. "Did you see Alexander this morning, trying to convince the gardener to let him help with the rose pruning? And Victoria attempting to teach the stable cat to sit like a proper lady? They're going to change the world, those two," Christopher said with satisfaction, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of Rose's head, just like their mother did. The transformation in both their lives over the past 5 years had been nothing short of remarkable. Rose had grown into her role as Duchess with a grace and intelligence that had gradually won over even their harshest critics, while Christopher had discovered that marriage to a woman who challenged him intellectually and supported him emotionally had made him not just happier, but more effective in all his endeavors. "The letter from the Queen arrived this morning," Christopher said, pulling an official envelope from the stack of correspondence. "She's requesting your presence at the next court presentation. It seems your work with the foundling hospitals has impressed the royal family." "Our work," Rose corrected automatically, though her eyes shone with pride at the recognition. "I could never have accomplished any of it without your support and connections." The Vale Foundation for Abandoned Children had indeed become one of the most respected charitable organizations in England, providing not just shelter and education, but hope and opportunity to children who had been cast out by circumstances beyond their control. Rose had used her own experience of abandonment to create programs that were both practical and transformative, while Christopher had leveraged his political influence and financial resources to ensure their initiatives received the support they needed. Emma's letter arrived as well, Christopher continued, sorting through the remaining correspondence. "She's thriving in her first season, and she credits her success entirely to the confidence you helped her develop." Rose smiled, thinking of the young woman who had become like a daughter to her, now 21, and taking London society by storm with her intelligence, wit, and genuine kindness. Emma was always destined for greatness. She simply needed someone to help her see her own worth. "As did someone else I know," Christopher said quietly, his voice filled with the love and admiration that had never dimmed despite the challenges they had faced. The early years of their marriage had indeed been difficult, marked by social ostracism, political opposition, and the kind of cruel gossip that could destroy lesser relationships. But they had weathered every storm together, their love growing stronger with each challenge overcome, their partnership deepening with each shared triumph and setback. "Do you ever regret it?" Rose asked softly, a question that had become something of a ritual between them over the years, though she already knew his answer. "Never," Christopher replied without hesitation, taking her hand in his and raising it to his lips for a gentle kiss. "Every difficulty we've faced has only proven how right we were to choose each other. Every scandal we've survived has only made our love more precious. And I would choose you again, Rose said, her voice thick with emotion, in every lifetime, in every circumstance, against every obstacle. You saved me, Christopher, not just from poverty or social ostracism, but from believing that I was unworthy of love. You saved yourself, Christopher corrected gently. I simply had the good fortune to recognize your worth and the wisdom to fight for the chance to share your life. As the sun began to set over the gardens of Vale Manor, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, the Duke and Duchess of Vale held each other close and marveled at the life they had built together. Their children would grow up understanding that worth was measured by character rather than birth, that love was more powerful than prejudice, and that courage could indeed change the world. And somewhere in England, in foundling hospitals and orphanages where abandoned children faced uncertain futures, the story of Christopher and Rose would be told as a reminder that no one was beyond redemption, that love could indeed conquer all, and that sometimes the greatest fairy tales began with the darkest circumstances. Rose had been cast out of her home and abandoned while still young, but a principled duke had indeed changed her fate. More than that, he had shown her that true nobility came not from birth or title, but from the courage to love without reservation, to fight for what was right, and to believe that every person, regardless of their past, deserved a chance at happiness. Their love had transformed not just two hearts, but an entire understanding of what was possible when people chose to see past surface circumstances to the deeper truths that connected them. In a world that often seemed determined to keep people apart based on arbitrary distinctions, Christopher and Rose had proven that love, when it was real and strong and supported by unwavering commitment, could overcome any obstacle that fear and prejudice might place in its path. Their love story became a beacon of hope that illuminated the truth that genuine worth comes from character, not circumstances, and that true love has the power to transform not just two hearts, but an entire society's understanding of redemption, forgiveness, and second chances. Duke Christopher Vale and Duchess Rose proved that when love is built on mutual respect, shared values, and unwavering commitment to seeing the best in each other, it can overcome any obstacle that fear and prejudice might place in its path. Their union showed the world that the greatest courage lies not in following society's rules, but in having the strength to love without reservation and to believe that everyone, no matter how far they may have fallen, deserves a chance at happiness and redemption.